It's the week ending Saturday the 7th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the leaking of a draft decision by the US Supreme Court overturning abortion rights, Tory MP Neil Parish resigning after watching porn in the House of Commons, and the World Cup shirt worn by Maradona for his Hand of God goal selling for £7.1 million. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Joe Evans and Julia O'Driscoll. And from the Week magazine itself, the paper version, its assistant editor, Leaf Arbuthnot. And Leaf, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How to take a pay cut without leaving your house.
There's a dedication to doing this show, isn't there, Mrs. O? You have gone home to LA. Have you taken a 20% pay cut for this performance, Mrs. O? Disgusting.
I will not.
Yes, you will.
Probably I will, yes.
What do you make of that, Sharon? Seriously, what do you think? A firm saying...
I think it's not fair, and I don't understand. What is their argument for taking the 20%? I do not get it.
Sharon Osbourne on her new Talk TV show, The Talk, on Monday. Leaf, what was she talking about?
A London law firm called Stevenson Harwood has said it's going to allow staff to work remotely, but it will pay them 20% less than their current salary, which basically means that junior lawyers at the firm who have starting salaries of £90,000 would be paid £72,000 if they decided that they wanted to work from home forever.
Why?
So basically, Stephen Harwood has said that the lower pay package reflects the lower cost of not commuting into the capital. But they also said that people who do work from home permanently would be able to claim travel expenses if they did have to come into the office.
Okay, so from a travel expense point of view, Joe, I guess that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? It's a bit like London waiting. But we know that people aren't necessarily working less if they're working from home. They're essentially doing more hours that would be billable if they were freelancers because they are saving on that commute time. So in a sense, you could argue they should be paid more.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is the logical extension of the sort of hypothetical discussion that we've been having on this podcast a few times and just generally societally since the pandemic began. What happens when the world goes back to normal and working habits that have developed during the pandemic collide with the way that the world used to be? Obviously, as you said, the debate has raged throughout the pandemic, who gains and who loses when staff start working from home, because obviously employers save money and time, but they also then have to pay their home bills like internet and electricity, water, that kind of thing. Employers save money as well because they can reduce their office spaces, that kind of thing. And so I think, as I say, it's just the collision of pandemic work habits colliding with the world going back to normal, which I guess was always inevitable, and this is how it's going to play out.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, that this is no longer hypothetical, Julia, because we have on this show talked about working from home quite a few times for obvious reasons, spurred on by the pandemic. But we're over 2 years into this now. This is reality. People have moved jobs. They have moved around the country. They have had children. They have adapted to working from home. We are in that new space. Do you think this is something that you're going to see catch on?
I don't know if it is. I think companies and businesses are really having to assess for themselves what they want the future of their workforce to look like and how it's going to work in kind of this post-pandemic era. And I thought this story was quite interesting given that Airbnb, I think this week, also announced they will allow all their employees to work flexibly in up to 170 countries around the world for at least 90 days a year. So, I mean, if you want to travel the world, continue your digital nomad lifestyle, then maybe Airbnb and startups are the way to go, rather than perhaps more traditional firms who want to get people back into the office or aren't so keen on kind of a hybrid working style.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting parallel, isn't it, Leaf? Airbnb, because, you know, what are the brand values of Airbnb? It's all about going all around the world, isn't it, and being anywhere. Whereas for a law firm, I wonder whether this story was planted by them as a press story to say, we are clamping down on working from. No one's going to take this offer to take 20% less salary, and we think people should be in the office. Is that the message behind this, do you think?
I think it probably is, but also I think it's probably coming down from the top because generally people who are higher up in businesses, as far as kind of surveys go, seem to be a bit keener for their workforce to be in the office than very junior staff and women who often see the advantages of flexible working much more. So I can imagine senior people at the law firm maybe getting a bit frustrated with a sea of empty desks around them. And we saw something quite similar in government very recently with Jacob Rees-Mogg going around and putting slightly passive-aggressive notes on empty desks in Whitehall. And it's clear that some people who are heading up kind of big offices basically feel energized by the physical presence of their junior staff, whereas some junior staff don't feel that actually they're more productive when they actually have to be in an office, and they'd much rather stay at home and do their work from there.
Well, we can put this to the test because unusually this week we have a panel of young bucks. You're all under 30. And often one of the things that older people say, is that the generational divide would be disadvantageous to younger people, because how can you possibly work your career? How can you gain ground if you're not pressing the flesh, making contact, learning how things work on the ground? Do you think that's right, Joe? Or do you think that Leaf's point that younger people are actually kind of used to silo working, doing everything through the internet anyway, and have now grown up in this environment that they'd prefer it as a WFH environment?
I don't want to sit on the fence because I know that's the frustrating thing to do in these situations, but I do genuinely think it depends on who you are. I think if you're a particularly career-focused person, if you're someone that wants to get ahead in your working life and progress through your company, then obviously there's value to having FaceTime with your bosses. And if you're someone that just sees sort of your work as a means to live and doesn't live to work, then I think that obviously working from home is far more applicable. To use Leaf's example of older workers versus younger workers, it's worth noting that in this Stevenson Harwood scheme, partners don't have the choice to work from home at all. If you're a partner member of the law firm, that's off the table for you. This is only aimed at younger staff members. And I think it will probably end up being a breakdown between those incredibly ambitious lawyers who want to make partnership and make the big bucks in the UK legal scene, and the people who are just quite happy to tick along, earning associate wages, have no interest in getting to partner level, and would rather maintain a work-life balance.
Well, that's it, isn't it, Leaf? If I forget about the money and the 20%, but just on a status level, if I said to you, right, you're currently the assistant editor, you will never get to be editor of the week if you continue to work from home. That cannot happen for you. What would that make you think? For a lot of people, that would make them decide, exactly as Joe was saying, like, do I value my ambition more, or do I value, I suppose, my quality of life more?
It's true. And one of the things that I'm really interested in about this story is that we've seen a kind of culture warification of this debate. So generally, the older generations like to sort of say, oh, the feckless youth, they just want to work from home and they've got no interest in climbing up the ladder. But actually, I think that maybe slightly more savvy firms than this law firm will realize that if they want to hold on to staff that are bright and kind of nomadic, that they will have to show some flexibility when it comes to the location of their working day. I do think that there's something to be said for actually physically getting to know your colleagues more than just, as a sort of face on Zoom. Partly because in my career, I've learnt loads by just sort of seeing how, for instance, people make a telephone call and how they speak to you just generally about your day. Working life isn't just about achieving tasks. It's also about becoming a sort of a person within a team. And that stuff is really hard to do if you're not in an office, I think.
But again, maybe generationally, it's a bit easier if that's what you've grown up with, Julia.
I don't know if it necessarily is, because I also think, realistically, if you're permanently working from home, the chances are there are going to be occasions where you need to come into the office, have those in-face meetings, do that in-person networking. And I think that becomes more difficult if you're just used to this way of working that does reduce your face-to-face contact. And I also think it seems a little unfair that the pressure is being put on younger workers to just adhere to the way that things have been done, rather than kind of senior staff looking at the ways they've been working and also questioning how they can adapt and make it work. And I think that's where kind of a hybrid working style lots of firms have adopted post-pandemic has proved pretty effective. People are saying that, they're really enjoying having the mix of being able to go in and work from home. So I think the kind of all or nothing approach does just feel a little bit outdated and short-sighted.
And what about diversity, Joe? Because that's another issue that's come up, maybe as part of that culture warification that we were referencing. There was that letter, wasn't there, from Apple employees claiming that the directive to go into work there at Infinite Loop would make Apple younger, whiter, and more male-dominated.
No, you're quite right. This is one of the big concerns. And as Leaf pointed out earlier, people that tend to prefer flexible working are often, younger mothers and people that, are not historically as represented in the sort of management structure of companies. As you say, Apple have raised this issue with Tim Cook when they basically said, we're going to try and get people back in the office. We want to lose the hybrid basis of our working model, which is very odd if you're a technology company, because you would think that you would have the sort of infrastructure to quite easily continue with hybrid working. The other element of this that I think is quite interesting is the money element of the Stevenson Harwood project or plan. When you just said that I'm still below 30, but when I was slightly younger, I was a cub reporter on a legal magazine, and one of the things that massively matters to young lawyers specifically is their pay package. The website that broke the news of this plan at Stevenson Harwood is called Roll on Friday, and they every year when the new salaries are announced for young lawyers, they would always be sort of the first to break these stories because lawyers love bragging about what they earn, and the young trainees would always want to brag about what they earn. And I do wonder actually whether just sort of slapping a financial penalty on people for not coming into the office will solve the issue for companies like law firms that do tend to attract this crowd of people that are really quite happy to brag about their pay packet.
Well, will it, Leaf? What do you think is going to happen?
I don't think that many people are going to accept this big pay cut in order to stay at home. And I think that they'll probably try and push for hybrid working models that we've talked about. So while it's quite an interesting idea, I'd be very surprised if it was really widespread. That said, with companies like Airbnb, I'm sure that, that those sorts of companies will move towards a completely, remote working culture fairly seamlessly, partly because they're so full of young people already, and they're run by younger people as well.
I mean, it seems to me, Julia, that at the beginning of all this, when everyone had to, because of the pandemic, suddenly accelerate the technology and get on Zoom and get on FaceTime and whatever, there was a resistance. There was a feeling that it could never match a real face-to-face meeting, and that, work couldn't be done as productively. But sort of slowly, you almost forget who you've met and who you haven't met in real life, quote unquote. I'm looking at you and suddenly realizing, actually, I've never met you. I think I've once at the pub for 10 minutes met you, but basically I've never met you, Leaf. And yet I feel like I know you because we're doing this show remotely. It sounds the same as when we were in a room. A lot of people's jobs have just evolved like that now.
Yeah, I think it's been quite interesting from my experience of going back to the office kind of from the start of this year. Even just those first few weeks, you could hear colleagues saying, "Oh, nice to meet you in person, blah, blah, blah." And that's just waned and waned. Even as new faces are coming in and new people are joining the team, it's just a very kind of hearing the language adapt and the conversations adapt, and people are getting much more used to just having the headset with them. And is this meeting in a room or is it online? And kind of actually I've seen that it's working quite fluidly in practice, because I think, we are just adapting to it and ready for it now.
But I suppose, conversely, the problem, Leaf, is that there will be some people that feel, high up in organisations like this, that feel that actually their job requires a human connection. Their job is not about being something where you can't tell whether you're on a computerized meeting or a real meeting. It shouldn't be something that feels like a technological function.
Yeah, totally. And I was really interested in a YouGov survey that found that I think it was about half of business leaders said that it was likely the remote working would be a drain on creativity and collaboration. And so there is this feeling in some businesses that if that without those kind of that coming together, that businesses won't be as kind of dynamic. But I think that feeling is slightly less shared by the general public, who are less likely to say that that working from home will kind of be a drain on creativity.
I suppose though, Joe, in a way, the fact you've got a company that's just making a policy on this is what we're doing moving forward. If you work from home, you earn 20% less. Maybe that's encouraging for people on both sides of the debate because it isn't hypothetical anymore. It is like, this is what's going to happen now. We are at a stage where this conversation's come of age, and this is how some people are going to work.
That's it. We've spent the last 2 years hypothesizing about it. Now we get to see what the actual policies look like in action. As Leaf has just said, I suspect that it would always break down to exactly what those two polls she referred to illustrate, that bosses want people in work, and people who are paid less and are less committed to their jobs than perhaps their bosses are would quite like to be flexible. I suspect that's how it'll always break down. All
right. Joe, you're up next after this.
Brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sell luxury holiday homes in top UK locations, with a potential 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at our flagship resort in Cornwall. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
Joe, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A brewing storm in the Asia Pacific.
China also claims Taiwan, and China is so much more powerful than Taiwan. And China says that it will not exclude the use of force against Taiwan, and it's been conducting military exercises around Taiwan. So this is some similarity in between the two. And therefore, we try to see what we can learn from Ukraine in defending ourselves.
Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu speaking to CNN on Monday. Joe, what was he talking about?
He was talking about growing Chinese aggression towards Taiwan and China's position that it would like to unite Taiwan with the mainland. This week, we got the news that the US has held top-level talks with the UK to discuss how to cooperate more closely on reducing the chances of a full-blown war between China and Taiwan.
Now, this has been bubbling away for a very long time. We talked about it on the show a couple of years ago as a kind of, this could happen any moment soon type story. It didn't. Is it going to happen any moment soon?
So the concern is that China has increasingly been ramping up military activity. In October last year, it dispatched 150 military planes into Taiwan's air defense zone. At the time, Xi Jinping said that it was part of an effort to complete the historical task of reunifying the island with China. The Taiwanese government in Taipei has always dismissed this claim and said that Taiwan will defend itself. The interesting thing about the talks that we now know have taken place between the UK and the US is this is the first time that they've ever discussed a specific contingency plan for the outbreak of a conflict. The people who leaked news of this to the Financial Times did say that it wasn't in response to any imminent threat. But quite obviously, with Russia charging into Ukraine in February, the idea of a sort of major conflict that for years has been assumed to be impossible is now feeling somewhat more possible.
Yes. That does seem to be the obvious background, doesn't it, Julia? What parallels do you think there are between Ukraine being invaded by Russia and the likelihood of Taiwan suffering a similar fate at the hands of China?
Yeah, so there are obviously some direct parallels if we're thinking about kind of the size of China's military forces against Taiwan's. China spends around 25 times more on its military than Taiwan, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which obviously, if we then think about the situation between Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine has been fighting quite a different war in terms of its use of weapons and tactics as well than Russia, which is much more heavily armed and has more troops as well.
I mean, if those parallels are relevant here, Leaf, what are the lessons that people in Taipei could learn from people in Kyiv about how to defend yourself against a larger aggressor?
I think one of the key lessons is that it really helps to be pally with the UK, the EU and the US. I mean, the US already supplies Taiwan with vast amounts of arms. I think it was 5 billion in 2020. But really, the Ukraine's resistance has been due to the extraordinary bravery and strategic genius of their people, but also to an enormous amount of army material, as they call it, basically hardware and weapons that's been flowing in increasing amounts from the West. So if I were in Taiwan and worrying about the future of the country, I would be trying to get as armed up as possible. Of course, there is this idea around that the debacle of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which obviously hasn't gone to Putin's plan, that is, might be giving China pause. And so I've been reading a little bit about that idea. But on the other hand, it might actually be that China is considering striking sooner than it would otherwise, because it feels that the West's attention is elsewhere at the moment.
And also has a similar grip, doesn't it, over its people's imaginations as Putin does in Russia. You know, most Russians still support what's going on in Ukraine, or at least that's what they're prepared to tell pollsters.
Yeah, they do seem to support the war that they're not allowed to call a war. And interestingly as well, in China, there was some kind of sign of a lively debate going on about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that was then stifled by the Chinese authorities. So there seems to be a bit of an anxiety maybe in the top brass in China that too much kind of sympathy for the Ukrainians could be a bad thing, perhaps for this kind of unification project.
Yeah, because literate Chinese people, I don't mean that to be patronising, Julia, but I guess I mean just Chinese people who have access to foreign press and who think outside what they're fed. If they're making that comparison, it's not the greatest bit of propaganda, is it, for let's invade Taiwan?
No, absolutely. And as Leaf was saying, there has been some kind of debate around whether the fact that Putin's plan hasn't gone to plan is actually suggesting that the likelihood of China invading Taiwan has decreased somewhat in recent months, particularly having seen the response from the international community in terms of not only kind of supplying weapons to Ukraine, but also hitting Russia with economic sanctions, which, if something similar were to happen in China, where its economy is already kind of stalling, its growth rate is stalling, it could have really serious implications for the country.
And yet, Joe, for the Taiwanese, if they're making that comparison, we don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to end. Like, we know they've put up a valiant defense. But, fast forward 20 years, and sadly, it could be that it is all Russia anyway, and thousands of people died trying to defend it. So, if you take that view, there's a sort of inevitability to the conquest of Taiwan. The lesson for Taipei looking at Ukraine might be, don't put up a fight.
Lots of people in Taiwan, I think, are watching the war in Ukraine with a mixture of hope and also absolute dread. As you rightly say, we in the West would look at what's happened in Ukraine and say that they've fought very valiantly and that they've been hugely successful in holding off the Russian advance. It should also be said that large swathes of the country have been absolutely devastated and destroyed, and that is going to take a long time to rebuild, whether they win or not. I think the lesson to learn really from what's happened in Ukraine is that the best thing that a country can do in a situation like the one Ukraine has found itself in, or that Taiwan could potentially find itself in, is build up defences and essentially hope that you can hold out for long enough for help to arrive. Had Russia have swept through Ukraine in 2 weeks, as was the original plan, I don't think you'd have seen the international mobilisation like we've seen over the last few weeks. The other thing, as you've just said, is we don't know how the war in Ukraine will end, but what we do know is how it began. And all of these things we've been talking about, things like sanctions, at the end of the day, did not deter Russia from charging over the border and trying to take control of the capital city. They may now have retrenched into the east of the country, but we know that didn't stop the Kremlin from deciding to invade. And I would imagine, if you're the Taiwanese government, the combination of the fact that sanctions didn't deter Russia and also that China is also nuclear armed would be a massive concern.
One of the issues when we're talking about the comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine is that it's all very well for the West to slap lots of sanctions on Russia, but Russia's economy was already much more distinct from the kind of West economies than China's is from our economy. And so the idea that we could impose any sort of same level of sanctions on China and not suffer extreme economic repercussions at home that would possibly then, lead to a lack of kind of faith in the project itself among voters is a serious one. And I'm a bit cynical about whether, this extraordinary response that we've seen in the West to the Ukraine invasion could really be reproduced in the case of China invading Taiwan. And I'd also point out that one of the reasons why Europeans have been so struck by, kind of moved by the horrendous situation in Ukraine is frankly that it's really quite close by. It's war in Europe, whereas I'm not quite so sure that there'll be a similar level of complete understanding and sympathy, unfortunately, for the Taiwanese people who are culturally, very different from Europeans and Westerners, even though, of course, they do have a thriving democracy.
I think that's absolutely right. To expect the type of sanctions that we've seen slapped on Russia to be slapped on China in the event of aggression would be very unrealistic. As Leaf points out, Russia has an economy, or an export economy, that's roughly the same size as Spain's, which gives some context for the scale of difference between that and China. What it is worth noting here, however, though, in terms of how close Ukraine is to Europe and that mobilising the sort of Western response to a large extent, is that one thing that does slightly complicate this is that Taiwan has a very, very ambiguous defence pact with the United States that dates back to 1954. What isn't hugely evident is what the US would do in the event that China does try to invade Taiwan. it could be the case that that defence pact is interpreted as we send troops, which would obviously completely change the complexion of a conflict. We've then got the AUKUS military pact between Australia and the UK, which does then create the situation that if the United States is drawn into the conflict, would the UK and Australia be drawn into the conflict? So there are sort of, while I think the sanctions point is absolutely fair enough, there are quite complicated moving parts in the background here in terms of mutual defence that don't exist in the case of Ukraine.
And also, why would this be a red line? You know, we've seen what China have been doing to the Uyghur people. We've seen what China have been doing in Hong Kong, and the international community has frankly not done very much about that. Why is this any different, and why would China care?
I think the fact that, you know, the talks between the US and the UK took place in the month after Russia invaded Ukraine kind of speaks a lot to why this is potentially back on the global agenda as kind of an urgent priority. There's a lot of attention as to how the West should support its allies against kind of much bigger powers and what its role should be in kind of the changing geopolitical landscape.
That's completely right. I would also say that ever since Taiwan sort of did its split with China, the West has been really involved in it. And so there's kind of decades of kind of mutual talks and interest there. The US has an American institute, which is an embassy in Taipei, and the UK also has a British office. So I think there would be a feeling potentially in the West that if the West didn't stand up for Taiwan, it would be seen as a move of great weakness.
And Joe, you know, it's a cliche, isn't it? How many things, when you look at the label, say made in Taiwan. For businesses, you know, if you're listening to this, you run a business and you're doing your manufacturing in Taiwan. Is that something you should be thinking about, that this is a country that could imminently be invaded?
Well, yeah, this is something that sounds incredibly boring, but Taiwan is the biggest producer and exporter of semiconductors in the world, which obviously would have massive business implications if the country were to be invaded. There is the obvious disaster in terms of the bloodshed that would follow, but then it would also be a disaster for businesses around the world. I think the reality in terms of why this is so serious for the West is kind of a combination of factors, one of which Leaf has just alluded to, which is that the US, particularly as the leader of NATO, has sort of dipped its quill far too deeply into Taiwanese sovereignty to now abandon the island if it was to be invaded. And the second is that we're now, 22 years into the century that is supposedly the Chinese century, and China's engaged in 19 land disputes, a mixture of maritime and land border disputes. The reality is that I don't think the West is going to want to allow China to get away with victory in even one of those territorial disputes, especially given that some of the more serious ones are with countries like India, which are armed with nuclear weapons. This is really about restraining a country before they become too powerful to be restrained. And I don't think the West, and particularly the US, will want to be seen to have fallen at the first hurdle in terms of controlling China in their Chinese century.
Okay. Handbrake turn, jazz hands at the ready. We're going to be talking about musicals after this. Okay, Julia, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A Not So Happily Ever After.
Well, that was reviving, wasn't it? Forget current affairs. This is the show I really want to be doing. Cinderella the musical. And if you missed it in the West End, Julia, it's almost too late, so get a ticket whilst you can.
Yeah, if you enjoyed that, unfortunately, you've only got a few weeks left to see it. So the end of the run was unfortunately announced this week, and this is after the production has suffered kind of real hits throughout the pandemic. It was meant to open in 2020. It got delayed, obviously, because of the pandemic several times. And so it was finally able to open in August last year. It then had to stop performances over Christmas and January due to the Omicron variant. And so it's really just been a bit of a disaster for this fairy tale.
Okay. So obviously that's very sad for all the stage crew and the actors and everything else, and for fans of Andrew Lloyd Webber. But so what? Why is this your story of the week, that a show is closing? Shows close.
So there's two elements to this. One is that the cast and stage crew have said that they found out about the show closing mainly via social media. And Andrew Lloyd Webber's really useful group, who are the theatre company that run it, have said that that isn't the case, that agents were contacted and, every effort was made to inform them ahead of time. But I think there's been a real kind of outrage and outpouring on social media about the fact that kind of performers who were really hit in the pandemic with performances being cancelled are yet again being kind of treated as an afterthought to kind of slowing ticket sales and kind of the business of showbiz.
But presumably they were paid for some of that run they didn't do during the pandemic. So, I mean, that's part of the cost, isn't it? That's part of the losses the show has made, is that they were being paid when they weren't performing.
No, well, some people are annoyed because they had just been hired and they haven't even started performing. So they were getting all excited about the fact that they were going to be on stage, and then they didn't ever get to do that.
Yeah, and these are like 1-year contracts, aren't they, if you're in a big West End musical? So you've presumably turned down lots of other work so that you can do it as well.
Yeah, massively. And been training and in rehearsals, the whole thing.
But is this new, Joe? I mean, theatre is a really precarious business. There's a reason why there's only a few magnates like Lord Lloyd Webber and Cameron McIntosh who put on these big shows, and it's because there's an enormous gamble involved. You don't know what's going to put bums on seats. Hits are actually rare.
No, you're quite right. I think what's new about this is that it's a Lloyd Webber show that's gone so dramatically wrong. But at the end of the day, Lloyd Webber is first and foremost he's a businessman before he's an artiste. And the reality is that this show was losing £100,000 a week. And so it's, not rocket science that Andrew Lloyd Webber, much as I'm sure he's devastated and saddened to have had to upset all of his cast, is just making a business decision about the fact that it's become unpalatable to keep running it, I suppose.
Well, except it's not that simple, is it, Leaf? You can hear my enthusiasm, can't you? I know too much about musicals. Trying to sit on the fence here. I do genuinely want to be doing a show about musical theatre. It's not that unpalatable in a way because he's taking the show to Broadway. So there's an interesting discussion here as well, isn't there, about why does he think this might work in Broadway when it hasn't worked in the West End? Is that just simply about different tastes? Or is something going wrong in the London theatre scene, which actually is more relevant to everyone listening?
I'm not exactly sure why he's decided that it's going to work very well in Broadway, but all I know is that Andrew Lloyd Webber is a canny businessman, as we've said. So I doubt it's he's just sort of sticking his finger up in the air and hoping that, it'll work on Broadway. There's probably been a lot of analysis to suggest that it probably will do well. I've been to the theatre quite a lot recently, and the theatre was full when I was there last. I saw Jerusalem last weekend. So it seems that there are a lot of people who are enthusiastic about returning to see plays after so much time away. But we've also heard from some people that they're anxious about going to theatres when a lot of people who are sitting in the theatre aren't masked. And on the other hand, we've also heard people saying, oh gosh, well, I don't want to go and sit through an entire play with a mask on my face. So there might be a few kind of COVID reasons that are stopping people from going to the theatre as well.
Yeah, did you see that piece, Julia, in the New York Times by one of their theatre critics who came to London to watch a whole load of shows and report back on what she'd seen? And instead of just reviewing the shows, she spent at least half the article talking about how she was just staggered that in the West End the audience are maskless and she didn't feel safe.
Yeah, and I think the theatre industry in London obviously felt that in order to welcome back audiences in high numbers, that was a necessary step to take. But I do also think that, during the pandemic, we saw some musicals and productions also move online. So you could now watch it at home for far less. It's much more accessible to much bigger audiences. So I also think that kind of audiences who want to go to the theatre, probably, to bring in new audiences after the pandemic is going to be quite tricky. It's those kind of traditional or theatre goers who don't want to go back and wear a mask. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of putting off new viewers.
Yeah, well, we have a cost of living crisis, don't we, Joe? And obviously, the theatre-going demographic is not usually the segment of society that's reflected when people talk about that. They're not the people that are choosing between heating and eating, obviously, if they're spending 50 quid on a theatre ticket. But they are spending 50 quid on a theatre ticket, and they might just be looking at their expenses and thinking, I can't afford to do that anymore.
No, that's quite right. I've just bought 4 tickets to Mamma Mia for my mother's birthday, which is a decision that I am only slightly regretting already. And it is a very expensive thing to go and do. I do also think that there's an element of what Julia just said that comes into this, which is possibly that just taste is changing. If you look at the sort of big breakout musical theatre event of the last few years, it's something like Hamilton, which sort of blends more modern music style and that kind of thing. listening to that clip at the beginning of the Cinderella show, it's very sort of classic Lloyd Webber, right? Which is possibly why I found myself laughing and rolling my eyes throughout the clip. And I just wonder whether perhaps this is just that Andrew Lloyd Webber has maybe had his moment, and that, his particular brand.
I hope no one has to sit next to you when you're watching Mamma Mia.
I mean, yeah.
You're rolling your eyes at Cinderella. What are you going to do in Mamma Mia? You better just bring a massive turtleneck.
I know, and think of how loudly I'll be speaking because I'll have earplugs in as well.
But Leaf, actually, this show, Cinderella, was marketed as not quite a sort of hip-hop musical, but definitely kind of Cinderella with a bit of, like, street culture in it, if you look at the poster art and stuff. And yeah, you hear the music, it's obviously been written by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it is classical. But nonetheless, it was a kind of feminist interpretation of Cinderella, wasn't it? Supposedly postmodern. And yet that doesn't seem to be winning bums on seats. Is it like an authenticity issue, do you think?
I was quite struck listening to that clip by quite how familiar the Cinderella tale is. Just like, oh gosh, I mean, do we need to sit through another retelling of this fairy tale that we all know and kind of vaguely love? I'm not sure, and so perhaps a better, slightly treading on new territory would have been a better idea. And it's true as well that if it is trying to go for a sort of more streetwise vibe, I'm not sure Andrew Lloyd Webber is the person I would pick to lead me down that path in a sort of musical sense.
Okay, so then is this just about this one show, Julia? Because again, you're trying to make a wider point here, but I mean, Leaf referenced Jerusalem. I went to see that last week as well. We may have even been at the same performance, Leaf. We were at the matinee on Saturday evening.
Yes!
Oh, God, isn't that weird?
You could have met in person.
Talk about the London Metropolitan elite on a podcast, seriously. Anyway.
I don't want to make it worse, but I'm also going next week.
And I'm going in July.
Well, it is a great show.
So good. I bought it through the Week app, can I just say? It was very interesting.
Very wise.
Yeah.
I got it because my friend Ben inadvertently purchased a third seat because he couldn't use the app he was using to buy tickets. So I'm sure it wasn't the Week.
Great.
But anyway, that is a monster hit. There you are. We're all going to watch it. It's become a sort of must-see. So actually, with the right show, there's a real appetite to go back to the theatre, isn't there? It's not really a problem.
There is a real appetite to go back to the theatre, but I think, as we've mentioned, there's accessibility issues post-pandemic that are really being highlighted, and the cost of living crisis. And I think maybe Cinderella needs to be a bit of a warning to other productions and companies who are looking at stories that, actually, I think Leaf's got a point. We know the Cinderella story. It doesn't really matter how many bells and whistles you add to it. It's the same story at the end of the day. So I guess it's kind of a warning that, get creative and up your game.
I think rather than ask you a serious question, we're at that stage in the show where I'd just like to ask you what your favourite number from a musical is, Julia.
I
am what I am. No?
Mine's got to be Defying Gravity from Wicked. Absolute.
Of course. Yes. Leaf.
I love Jesus Christ Superstar, so it'll be the main song from that.
Okay. As in the title song. Da, da, da.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Okay. Good. I'm sure Lord Lloyd Webber, if he's found the show by searching his own name, will be happy with that. And Joe, king of musicals, Mr. Showbiz. I'm imagining something from Cabaret, something political. Miss Saigon, maybe?
I'm actually going to struggle to answer this question. What's this? Is there one called Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat? I seem to have enjoyed that. Is that Guys and Dolls, I think?
Is there one called Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat? Tell me it's not true. Hey, musical reference, everybody. Told you. Want to be doing a musical theatre podcast. Joe, with that, you've reached the end of your run on the Week Unwrapped because you're off to get a new job. Congratulations and commiserations for the rest of us.
Yeah, I'll be very sad to go, but yes, unfortunately, this is my last appearance.
Well, thank you for always bringing such lightness with your stories. A real ABBA-style sprinkle of joy.
Yeah, I'm glad I went out in Cinderella.
Thanks also to Leaf and Julia for their stories this week. Now, off we all go before the carriage turns back into a pumpkin. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.